starting from the end is Greg Peel, who many of you would know is now working with ASIP, but has a long history with the Bendigo Bank and in the finance sector. He's recently done a sea change and left the kids back at home somewhere in Bendigo, I think, and living in Nelson's Bay. Yeah, how beautiful. What a gorgeous place to be. Andrea Comestri, who's from the PACE Foundation, background in property. One of the things that he quite amazingly has just done, apparently, personally I'm struggling to believe that he could be sitting here at this stage and smiling, but he's just run 100 kilometres through the Blue Mountains about 4 days ago. Is that true? Are you sore? No? No? You were. But a few ice baths and other things. Extraordinary. So, Andrea absolutely knows how to go far. Next to him is Ben Gales, who's probably claim to fame, we think, is that he wrote the very first report that made reference to social enterprise in the UK. Yay. So that's a first. Ben has works in government, is very focused around how do we leverage policy and get better policy and systems to support social enterprise and social change. So we're going to hear more from Ben very shortly. As before, we heard from Catherine Greiner, Dr. Kylie Gwynn. Are you allowed to be called doctor yet? Yes. Just finished her PhD in collective impact, and I'm thrilled to let you know that Kylie, although she's very shy about this, she's just won a Sydney University medal for her collective impact PhD, which is an extraordinary effort. Worth a clap. And that medal's awarded to the person who in the previous year has graduated or completed achieving a high standard of academic proficiency and contributed to the life of the university and the community. So how you've juggled all of those things and this role at Paediatria, I'm struggling to find out, but we'll find out more shortly. Ask a busy person to do something, that's what they say, don't they? Next to Kylie is Greg Peel, I beg your pardon, Danny Lester. Danny is the Ombudsman in New South Wales, Deputy Ombudsman, again a long background in government and in working in communities, looking at how we get social change. He's part the way through an executive masters in public administration and looking at in depth at how governments develop policy and measure cost benefit to create national good. And of course, next to him is the wonderful Catherine Greiner that we've just heard from. Thank you so much for that those thought starters and that inspiration. So I'm going to start with you, Catherine. Catherine, what do you think are the key barriers that get in the way, in your experience? You talked a little bit about some of these, from enabling organisations to be nimble, agile, innovative, etc.
I guess we're all comfortable with what we know, so we get a bit locked in doing things because there was some success in a process or a product and therefore we repeat it. But I suspect that it might be fear. It's fear of the unknown, it's fear of the taking the risk, and it's also because KPIs don't encourage you to take a risk. KPIs are always about success on a very linear scale, and a lot of what we're thinking about is success on a more lateral scale. So I think that would be some of the things that I would
that's a very interesting point about KPIs. I mean, who doesn't have a set of KPIs they've got to perform to? It's part of how organisations work. The moment you get in there, you get a set of KPIs, and as you say, most of them are very quantitative things. They're not necessarily the things around being nimble and agile and innovative, yet we know they are key to our success. So how can organisations both hold that tension of wanting to get people to perform outputs get all the outputs happening, but still get the brain cells working more effectively and taking risks and doing those things? How have you seen any examples of it being done well?
I mean, there are a number, and I think there are people in the room that probably have very good examples. But my fear is having worked for the health department and family and community services for, I think I was there for about 20 years under many of its iterations, and I see it now from the outside. The thing that concerns me, and the question I ask myself, is how can a government become agile and nimble and still, because at the moment my perception is that what they've done is just abrogate the space and put it all out to the private sector. Now that's fine, but they actually didn't understand the whole process of agility in moving services to be delivered by the private sector. And they lost the concept of outcomes as opposed to outputs.
Yeah.
So I think that the leadership of anything always comes from the top down, but change has got to be driven from the ground up.
Yeah.
So the leadership driving the vision, if you like, we've got a vision and a mission, where would we be? But it's actually, it's like strategic planning. And we've all seen strategic plans that sit on the shelf and look fabulous in the book that they're published in, but people don't actually respond to that. So it's CEOs responding to their strategic plan, the leadership from the top, but enabling the change and in fostering and developing and creating the change from the ground up.
It's fantastic, and government is, in all of this work is so often so pivotal, as you've talked about. And maybe if I can just flip to you, Ben, to just respond to that, because how can government support and enable this kind of work? Because so often government is the funder or one of the funders. How can it better enable that sort of agility and change?
So I think I agree government has a key role, and my quick response is outcomes. So if we can actually measure, and Catherine, you mentioned earlier, data is everything. The right data is everything, and getting the right outcomes measure is absolutely crucial to facilitating that kind of collaboration. So yes, government's got a lot of data, it's got, yes, some funding. I think there's broad acknowledgement we don't have the answers. So how do you allow community to come up with solutions and government to provide the appropriate funding? So there's a number of initiatives we're doing. So one of the things I look after is the Office of Social Impact Investing. So we're trying to facilitate those collaborations and provide outcomes-based funding. At the other end of the scale, something that we've introduced as a government is outcomes budgeting. And we are literally trying to attach every single dollar to an outcome.
Wow.
Now, you're going to have to give us time on this one because it is complex. And then you have to firstly understand what is the outcome we're going to try to achieve, and then what is impacting on that outcome, and what can we do to change that outcome. So this is a journey. It's a long journey. It's 5-10 years. But in terms of, I think, some of the leadership from the top, that move to a focus on outcomes across government, a drive towards much better data, focusing on measuring those outcomes, there are, to my mind, encouraging moves.
That's fantastic. So what are you finding are the barriers to that change? What's holding it up, or what's in the way? Is there anything that others can do?
So firstly, helping us understand what the outcomes we should be measuring. I think that is a real challenge. Sitting up in Martin Place, we're not very good at actually understanding what success looks like on the ground. So I think often we measure the wrong thing. Secondly, and this is something that I'm sure all of us grapple with, is sharing of data and privacy. We struggle even to share data across government. Then you want to share data across layers of government. Then you want to share data with community, and then you want to share data with private providers. So if you look at the richness of data that, say, for example, Quantium have through credit card data and banking data, there is so much richness that we could find out about and use to better direct services, direct interventions, facilitate collaborations so people understand what's needed. But getting that data and sharing that data, wow, that's the challenge.
So what about for those in the room that are from the philanthropic side of the world, or they're not-for-profits working in community? What can they do to help break down those barriers and achieve, I guess, a collective movement toward this focus on outcomes rather than just on activities?
So if I think about what we've been doing in the Office of Impact Investing, and we've got about 6 social impact bonds up and running now, and they've been going for about 5, 6 years, and the early signs are hugely encouraging, really encouraging and successful. But one of the challenges we still grapple with is, and if I can use this, I think it'll make sense. In government, we need permission to fail, and we're really bad at that. So we can put money out and do a small innovative project, but if it's not successful, we get criticised still. So I think where philanthropy can partner with this, and it's not to replace government funding at all, but it's helping us with that permission to fail. So to get, and there is I don't know whether you call it a chasm or a bridge, there's lots of different ways of articulating this, but getting over that chasm, giving a permission to fail, and if we don't have that ourselves and we really struggle with that, how can we help bridge it?
That's great, thank you. I might just flip to you, Greg, up the end there. So obviously government has, as we've just been talking about, funds a lot of this work and initiative, but there's other forms of capital. There's a lot of capital in our world, slushing around in our world these days. How can we better access and utilise other forms of capital to fund and support social change?
I think what we've seen is what Ben sort of touched on is how those different streams of capital with different risk, yield and impact requirements sort of come together and collaborate to maximise their impact and outcomes. We used to term a phrase called blended capital solutions, which was in effect sort of bringing those different streams or different parties and stakeholders in social change and economic development together in a way that actually maximised the impact, but also maximised, if you like, the leverage of government support, the leverage of funding, such that institutional investors could also, in the early stage, normalise their risk and yield. But in a lot of cases, it's sort of a transition period. It's sort of, you need that at the start because the markets are still sort of understanding really what is the risk of social impact. And perhaps there is, at that basis, a need of more, like in the US, UK, there's more intermediary sort of platforms like community development finance institutions that actually have a role as that kind of intermediary, but it's not just a packager, it's actually somebody, an organisations that can mobilise and engage communities. It's a ground up sort of thing where if you can connect with your communities and create pathways for people to invest in society, their very community, that's the thing, and how to bring those different streams of capital together is a really important component of actually the answer.
Yeah.
I think anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you've been looking into this for a long time now. You've been doing this for a long time. And we've been talking about that. And we've seen some great examples. And as Ben just said, there's 6 social impact bonds now out there. So there's things happening, a lot more social enterprise occurring. But what do you think might be a game changer? What would just flip the way that we're doing things?
I think some of the things about the disruptive, innovation occurs in a disruptive market. So I don't think the way in which the current sort of banking system and the current framework of systems operate are not conducive necessarily to the types of innovation, the types of impact that is required. There's no compelling argument to be a disruptor if I'm a major bank. Why would I? I own the market. So what are we going to do to create new vehicles and new enterprise, and how are those vehicles actually supported? because it's really interesting, even in the philanthropic markets, they're sort of keen to support an impact or support an outcome, but there's a facilitator of an outcome that's required. There's a role in there, there's a gap that needs to be filled to actually make sure that those things come together. So as a game changer, I would be suggesting that there needs to be this capability to integrate the buy-in and engagement and mobilisation of communities and interface with the capabilities of these different streams of capital, but allow that to actually emerge and evolve from the ground up, not necessarily impose that sort of change, but actually have it sort of driven by community, if you like.
Yeah. That's a very important and a perfect segue. And it's true, because most major changes and social changes happen from the ground up. It's the masses that really start to shift their mindsets or their needs and their wants, and that's where it comes. So I might just switch to you, Danny, because you're working very much in community. And how can we get more transparency about the mindsets that funders come to the table with, to challenge those? How can we shift the power back to society, away from isolated projects and programs, and really start to get that groundswell happening?
It's a great question. I just put it down to inform to be informed. It's about shifting the intellect and the way by which information can be shared. Because if you share information, you empower people. And I think it goes back to, Catherine, your earlier point around data. We've got to fix the issue around the accountability but transparency of data. Because if you don't know what you don't know, then how can you make the best informed decision? And we operate that every day in relation to evidence-based data to form a view to then put a suggested or a recommendation back to government. I think also the other aspect is that, you know, we are dealing with, I think, super wicked problems, not just wicked problems, because the reality around the bio...
You heard it first here today. Super wicked problems.
Super wicked. Oh, that's an EMPA term, by the way. So there you go. I have to make sure to trademark that. But the reality around empowering communities, I think, comes back down to the analogy of it takes a community to raise a child. Now, I haven't heard that term in a long time. I used to hear it all the time when I was young, and I'm still young, I think. But I think what we've got to come back to is what are the grassroots? What does things keep people up at night? And that's how I start my engagement with communities that I work with. What keeps you up at night? Because that's what interests me. What are the aspects of what tomorrow can bring that can enable progress to occur? And I can say that the baseline data of what we are looking at presently in New South Wales is minimal. We don't understand where we are, where we need to lead in the next 5 years. So in my mind, we've got to come back to grassroots. In my mind, we've got to think about the conversation, the narrative by which individuals can shift the power and the dynamics, because what comes with authority and mandate is power. We've got to shift that, in my mind, back to community. Community, Aboriginal community in particular, I work very closely with. They know what they want. How can we enable that to occur? And how can we shift that authority from basically government-owned and government-controlled back to individuals, couples and families at large? And look, I make no secret that, in my mind, economic development is fundamental in terms of that shifting that dialect and making sure that economic development is a means to move progress and to enable community to reach their full and best potential. Because I think at the moment, the other reality as well, it's a famous Albert Einstein's quote, but if you can't say it simply, then you don't know it well enough. I think that's where we're at. Why come in with big jargon, big words, when reality is let's keep it simple. The other point is that as I constantly say to government, I know Ben, with the work that he's doing, it's critical, because I think social impact investment bond, in my mind, could be a way to look at super wicked problems that aren't universal, and it can be funded in that way. And I think you fellows are doing a good job in that regard, and watch this space. So I can confirm that, in my mind, as the Deputy Ombudsman, that this government and some of the bureaucracy is shifting their mind to coming back to the realisation is what does the consumer want or the customer want, and how can the system respond to that? And I've seen that, I've heard that through Tim Reading and his leadership at the present moment. So watch this space.
That's fantastic. I think I might just flip. It was wonderful words, Lester and Danny, and wisdom around the complexity of the problems we're trying to tackle. And they are super wicked, and they have long histories and often embedded in really complex trauma and tragedy and interpersonal, complex human stuff. And that's not something you just deconstruct or unpack in a day. They're long-term issues. So I think one of the things that I've noticed myself in working in this way is that we're so often impatient. We just want change to happen tomorrow. And if it doesn't happen tomorrow, as you talked about before, Ben, we get really disappointed because we failed. And we haven't failed. We just haven't had enough time to really see the change, because these are intergenerational issues we're often talking about. So how do we help, how can we help all of us to be less impatient and to be willing to go on that long journey more effectively?
You know, the New South Wales Public Service Commission oversees what's called a capability framework. It's the way by which public servants interact, and you know, there's 6 or so pillars. It's all based on IQ. Now, the challenge that I always have is about emotional intelligence, EI, empathy, social skills, the knowledge by which you understand. Because in my mind, if you do not understand the community you serve, who are you serving? And it comes back to the place-based...
And it's not understanding with your head, it's understanding with your
it's your
heart.
heart. Yeah, and look, the place-based area is really that in a nutshell. Whether or not it's a postcode or a region or certain area. In New South Wales, we've got what's called local decision-making. There's 7 regional alliances across New South Wales. It's in its infancy stage, but the reality is that in time, Aboriginal people have got the current capability capacity, but should have the opportunity towards greater decision-making in terms of services and programs. So in my mind, it's about emotional intelligence, and it's about immobilising that within the debate around IQ, but it's making sure that we do not lose the end sight. And the end sight is what matters most in my mind. It's about how can we ensure that communities are vibrant and can reach their full potential. Because each individuals in this room here have got different levels of potential. It's about how do we manage that and how do we massage that, with the view that we've got to strike towards outcomes and not outputs. Because I can say to you, government are great at illustrating outputs, but it means diddly squat in terms of whether or not it's making a difference on the ground.
Very good. Okay, we might just turn to you, Andrea, for some real life examples. The PACE Foundation has been funding and supporting some really interesting ways of working through Pathways Home and Kickstart Cafe. You can talk about whichever you like, but on the ground, actually doing that, listening to the community, trying to work out what's needed and then responding to that.
Yeah, so I suppose Kickstart Cafe is a good example in terms of working with community. PACE is a property developer for the last 7 or 8 years between a number of different projects. We were in Riverwood, redeveloping a social housing estate, and part of the strong DNA of PACE, even before the foundation was established, which was only a couple of years ago, was that of community engagement. And, you know, property developers are not the most popular breed normally.
Possibly rising above bankers at the moment, though.
Yeah. So that's right. Yeah, it's good that the focus is on the banks at the moment. So it's hard to sell that message that we do it because we want social change and because we have a philanthropic DNA, and it is the truth within the organisation. And that's why then the foundation was created. So within the Riverwood area, there was very strong community engagement work done by PACE and its partners for years. And one of the one of the needs that became evident was that of addressing youth unemployment in the area, and that was entrenched within generations of their community. And so we worked very closely with the Riverville Community Centres, a number of different networks and stakeholders in the area, and realised that there was a need to create something and to do something. And so we actually, PACE first, and now it's been inherited by the PACE Foundation, created a social enterprise, a cafe, out of a shipping container, kitted out as a cafe, employing young local trainees, so employing them, not just training them, but employing them for a period of about 12 months, training them in Certificate 3 in hospitality, and partnering and serving the local community. But the key was to serve the hunger of the hungry workers on site, which consume an incredible amount of calories while they work on the site, and so coffees, energy drinks, and burgers and chips, trying to drive them towards healthier things, but they just need the energy stuff. So it was set up as a business, as a social enterprise, because we believe it's one of the fundamental beliefs of PACE and the Foundation now, of supporting self-sustainable or people that go on, organizations that go on the journey to self-sustainability. But the key there was to understand the need. And so we worked with the Riverville Community Centre to understand what was needed, with the local families in the area to understand what was needed. And so we established this as a social enterprise that had young people being referred from the Riverville Community Centre. Throughout their program, they would receive mentoring from us and the community centre. And it's difficult stuff. As you mentioned before, the 2-step forward, 1-step back. It is difficult because of different parties, because of some morning the young kid wouldn't turn up, and so we went through in 3 or 4 years. We employed and trained 13 young people. So not fast-paced type of turnover of young people, but working with them and trying to enabling them with work, with skills, and also with life skills. So the chef on site was the trainer himself, right. Work with an RTO as well. Obviously, they will provide the official training, the formal training. But the trick there was we want and continue to incubate the Kickstart Cafe as a charity that will eventually flourish by itself and multiply and expand. And now we sort of have a big plan of having it as a mobile cafe in different sites. And the key there was to make sure that we would balance the need to make it a business that is self-sustainable, and we've proven that it was, at least in the peak period of the construction site, but also with the outcomes that we were trying to achieve with the young people. And that is hard, because when you have someone that needs to be trained and mentored into performing in a business environment, you want to use a little bit of a whip sometime, but on the other hand, you also want to forgive mistakes, or to be supportive, and we were very lucky to have the right person on site managing the cafe, the chef himself, that fulfilled that role. And so the challenge will be that of replicating that across different sites.
So what do you think the difference has been for the community?